Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Igor Minar. I'm on the Angular team, and I'll be MC today. Tonight, we're going to have two cool presentations from actually both are from the Angular Core team members. Matias Niemelä is going to give us a presentation on forms in Angular. And then Jeff Cross, also known as Jirka Krzyż, is going to give us a presentation on benchmarking and bench press tool we use for writing Angular benchmarks. But before we get there are a few announcements we want to share with you. Angular 1.3 is finally out. It's been 3 weeks, but we skipped one meetup, so we're mentioning it now. There's a lot of cool stuff in 1.3, performance, better forms, accessibility, and many other things. We did a deep dive session and ng-Europe, so there is a link. You can check it out and see what's new in 1.3. I mentioned ng-Europe. We had a lot of fun in Paris about 2 weeks ago or so. 2 fun days with 800 developers. Good food, good wine. It was really good. Also, very good presentations. There are some highlights. Keynotes. We did sessions on 1.3. We did sessions on Angular 2. New router, material design, accessibility. Something to check out if you haven't seen any of these. We also disclosed some of the plans on Angular 1x post 1.3. So Pete Bacon-Darwin, he's been a core member for several years, is taking over the lead. I used to be the lead on Angular 1x for the past 4 years or so. Pete is taking over because it's a big job, and there are many things that I still want to get done. And this is 1x is taking me a lot of time, and it's better if I just have somebody else focus on 1x, and I get some other stuff done. So Pete is taking the lead on that. There are many features that are already in plans and in works. Internationalization is a big one. We kicked off of an effort to have a really good core support for internationalization, really important thing for big applications. We are backporting the new router. We expect the first demos to be shareable with you this week. And we work on material design, which is going to be delivered for 1x as well as for 2.0. I'm not sure how many of you know about material design. Show of hands. OK, about half. So for those of you that don't know, material design is a UI specification created by Google. And this specification has many implementations. And we're building one implementation specifically for Angular. You can see what we have at material.angularjs.org. This is still work in progress, but we're making really good progress. Some of the things that we finished are layout. We built a very nice Flexbox-based layout engine that is very versatile and allows you to build applications both for desktop and mobile. We also added support for theming. This is just the first wave of customizations that will allow you to do for your applications. Really cool stuff, and there's more to come. And we're continuously working on widgets. So we have pretty good support for basic form controls, things like progress bars, tabs. I think we're currently working on menus and things like that. So you can check out what we have on the website. There are 2 shows I would like to share with you and point out. One of them is Angular Adventures in Angular. It's a podcast that has been going on for a few weeks now. We were invited to come over and talk about 1.3 and 2.0 just last week. So there is a new episode on that, if that's what you are interested in. There is another show that is a Hangout show. It's a visual, so you get to see how we smile or not smile. This was kicked off by Todd Motto and Kent C. Dodd. And this is just a panel discussion. This was the first episode. There are more to come. John Papa is working on a style guide for Angular. This is a really cool effort. There is a lot that he's already put into this, a lot of effort, and it's really extensive style guide. We are iterating over it this week and next week, and we think that it's already in pretty good state. So if you want to see some of the good and bad practices, this is a good place to check out. ng-conf. If you saw ng-Europe and thought it was awesome, We're doing a conference here in the US in Salt Lake City. ng-conf has tickets for sale. The first round of tickets sold out within seconds last week, which was crazy. And there is a second and last round of tickets tomorrow. So if you want to come to ng-conf, tomorrow is the day to get your tickets. The last event I want to point out is we're doing this ng-fixit. It's a new kind of event we haven't tried really, at least not in the US. It's going to be a hackathon where we will invite developers like you to come and pair with us and fix Angular bugs, maybe work on some small features, maybe improve documentation. This first event is happening in San Francisco this Saturday. We still have few slots open. If you want to come, I suggest that you sign up quickly because the space is very limited. And with that, Matias, can you show us some really cool stuff with forms?
Okay. I need to just run a quick command on my server to make sure the slides work. Run this in the background. Okay. All right.
Do you want the mic?
Yes. Oh yeah, put it on the table. One moment. Start. 1 minute. Okay. The way that I do my slides is just super weird. I use S3 and then the caching affects it. So if I go the link at the wrong time, the slides break. So it just, the timing was a little bit wrong, but I'll provide the link in 5 minutes. Okay. So let me turn on them. Okay, sorry for the delays. Okay, so my name is Matias, and I live in Toronto, Canada. I'm here visiting for the week. And for the past 2 years, I've been working on the Angular team, almost 2 years. And for just over 2 years, I've been working with Angular. And this is a great framework. I love to contribute to it. The people who work on the core team are great, and the community is awesome. So my website is yearofmoo.com. And I started out with blogging about Angular, and that's what led me to work on it full time. So I will come back to the slide with the links, but for now, that's a picture of me right before I went bungee jumping one time. I was actually really scared. And that's the logo brand for my blog, yearofmoo.com, so please follow. Okay, so we're here to talk about forms and developing forms in Angular and what kinds of things we run into. So with that in mind, does anyone care to share any problems they've experienced with developing forms? It's pretty hard work at the end of the day when you think about it. It seems very easy. You just have a few input fields and do some validation, but it falls apart fairly quickly. So the idea is we create a few fields, user enters some data, we do some validations, and we send the data away. But what could possibly go wrong with this? If we have a form like this that's collecting data without Angular, we just assign a few IDs, we'd have an input field and a submit button, and then we would use JavaScript to hook into that to make that work. So forms on their own, they can function, but we need JavaScript to make everything happen. And the problem with this is that we end up having tons of JS code. So if we didn't use a framework to do this, we'd just have huge amounts. This is the smallest piece of JavaScript code I could think for this form. A simple validation, checking if the data is correct. And let's imagine that alert statement's just going to send it to the server. But the reason why I have it set up this way is so that I can test it out in the slides. So I try to submit the form, nothing's happening. I go back here, oh, I have to enter some text into that field. And if it's valid, we're going to have the alert statement. So if I type in hello, that data was sent to the server. OK, so forms in general, we need validations. And with the way that HTML5 is, we can kind of do those in the HTML, but at the end of the day, we're going to fall back to doing it in JavaScript. And, sorry, check if my slides are done. Hopefully this works. Yes, OK, the slides worked. Those are the links for the slides. I will show them after the link. Sorry, I couldn't get those in time. But we have the slides, we have the code, and we have the demo. So I'll refer back to the slide at the end of the presentation. Anyways, back to forms. So we know that form development is painful. And the stuff with the way that the data is managed and the complexity of the HTML and the validations all come together, and they make this really complicated mess. And then when you want to add other stuff on top of the form, it just falls apart, like animations and stuff like that, because the foundation of the forms isn't structured properly in place. Now, this is a crazy example. I'm assuming that all forms are bad, but I'm just assuming the worst example so I can sort of shed some light on how to improve your form code. So why does Angular do forms differently? Or how is it a better situation with Angular? Well, the idea here is that since Angular uses more HTML, it's sort of embracing HTML to declare and style out the functionality of your web page. That means that you have less JS code and more HTML. Not sort of a lot more HTML, but you can express more things in HTML than with just having to have JavaScript for everything. And the key thing here is that we have the scoping mechanism, and we have the components, the HTML components, and those are separate from each other. The directives themselves that we can use, we can put on top of the HTML code to really express what the HTML code is and to add validation. So with building forms in AngularJS, we're just going to use standard HTML5 markup. That gives us, required min length, max length, validations like that. ng-model is going to manage the data coming in from the user and putting that on the scope. And then finally, the documents are going to control when the page updates, and directives enhance everything. So what are the 4 basic building blocks? And this is just my own abstraction of what these 4 building blocks are. I imagine we have the data that we're going to be collecting. We have the components, such as the input fields, the logic themselves, which manage all the data, and the presentation. So here's an example of ng-model. I'm sure everybody here knows what that is. ng-model will track the data and put it onto a scope. So whatever the user types into the input field will show up on the scope, and whatever data changes in the scope will represent itself in the input field. So if we take a look at this field, we can see that we have an email field and a description. I can type in data into these 2, and it shows it's going to update into the scope. This means that I can pass an expression into my code. So if I just say right here, data.email, and I type in data.description, you can see as I start typing in, you can see the data show up, and the data show up for the input field. So description and email, right? However, the data itself is not valid, because that's clearly not a valid email address. So what Angular does is it has its own validations, and you can make your own validations, which will prevent the data that's being entered to be put on the scope until it's considered valid. So for example, if I set input type to email, now if I type in my email, I wish I had that email, but I don't. So if I type in my full email, it shows up. However, if I type an invalid email, it doesn't actually go to the scope. This is the whole premise of the validation system in Angular. And at 1.3, this whole system was drastically improved. While this talk is about forms, I'm not going to go into the specific API points, because that is a part of the 1.3 like the release of 1.3, and there's a lot of blog articles that talk about that. But I'm going to be building a sort of complicated form and then showing you how you can really improve the HTML code as you go along. OK, so let's continue. So we have the components in our page. We talked about the data. We have the components. And the components involve input fields, text area fields, selects, anything that could collect data from the user. The whole point of this is that ngModel will take care of all the nonsense of having input value and checking if it's null and stuff like that and then putting it on the scope. So here, for example, are a series of components that are valid in Angular. Email, address, input fields, numbers, dates. And we can even have a text field that has its own validators. For example, we want to check if a username is available on a server. We can have a username characters validator to check the characters first, and then the other validator to send it to the server. So with that in mind, that is the component, but then we have the logic which drives the way that the components interact with each other, the way the data is collected from the user. You know, we can use our own validations, we can use parsers and formatters, or we can have the controller to do some crazy stuff as well. Not to mention that when the form is actually submitted, the controller can handle that data as well. So here, for example, we have a form that's collecting data from the user to enter a city. And let's say for this city example, I enter my town where I live, Toronto. That would be acceptable. I can enter the coordinates. Let's just imagine that we have this omni input field that collects the valid data that we expect it to. So the way that this works is we have this parser, which accepts this data and then parses the data entered by the user and then spits out an object which is read on the scope. And with that in mind, we can have logic determine what input fields show up on the form. So in this case, we're saying that when the location is entered by the user and then parsed into this object, if the country is not within the, if the country isn't the United States, then we're going to show this extra check field to ask if the user wants to use their currency or not. So here is the code to make that directive work. And once again, we're loading in the ngModel controller, and we're setting a parser and a formatter to parse the data. The whole point of this is that the HTML code is sort of tying up all the pieces of logic and associating that with the data, and then the logic itself, the JavaScript code, will make all that happen. And here is the controller for that to work. So for example, for the location controller, we want to have it so that when the data is considered valid, it submits, and then it sends all the data to the server. So now, the next part is the presentation. So the presentation is responsible for showing and hiding different messages or animations of the form. If you think about error messages, that's a form of presentation. We've got to present to the user when something's invalid or valid, and maybe apply some animations along the way. So for example, in this example, we have a series of validations that are applied to the email validation once again. And you know, we have a min-length validator, a max-length validator, the email address availability validator, the email validator, and the required validator. That's already 5 different types of errors. And we can show that on the page like so. Now, this is a lot of HTML code, and that's fine. And I'll show ways to improve this. But the point is that we can tap into the model and show and hide data on the screen. OK, awesome. So now we get to the point that we have a working form. We've crafted the form together. We've set up ngModel. We have a controller to handle the submission. What do we do next? What we want to start doing is refactoring the HTML code. Now, we don't necessarily have to do this, but if you want your code to be more reusable, if you want your code to be easily testable, if you just want to make sure the code's in better shape overall, then consider refactoring the HTML. And the way that we could do this is we can use directives. And then this ends up being cleaner HTML, which is easier to understand for everyone. Imagine if you're on a brand new project and you see a 100-line HTML file that has all kinds of directives and mixtures of stuff. It'd be hard to get started with. But if the developers took the time into improving the quality of the HTML code, it makes it easier for everyone. OK, so we have a survey creator in Angular. And if I go back to here, I click on the demo link. Here is the survey creator. I'm going to remove the existing survey I created, and let's create a new one. So in here, I'm going to type in a title. I'm going to say Angular 2.0 stuff. We'll set a publish date. So tomorrow. Oh. Igor scared me. I thought I misspelled Angular. Okay. So we'll leave the description. We'll just have ... for now. So let's say these are questions for a survey. It's like input field, when is 2.0 coming out? Have another field, when is 2.0 coming out? And just, all these questions that people are asking. Okay, let's change it up a bit. Let's have a text field that says, express your fears about 2.0. All right, so the input field for the question, the input field for the text area. Both of these fields are required. Now, when I submit, it creates this nice survey for me, which I can give to other users and they can fill out. This is a pretty complicated project to just build with what Angular is, because you have this mix and mash between dynamic HTML creating dynamic HTML. So for example, here's our input field. I try to submit. Please enter this field. We can tell the validations work. I go back here. I edit this code. Edit. And right here, I say that we're going to have a select field and what other stuff we're going to ask about Angular 2.0. What will be removed? Or what do you want not to be removed? And we can say here, we want directives. Please keep directives. Please keep controllers. Please keep everything. And now we submit. We have the select element of that. So it's a really useful project. And my whole point of doing this meetup was to sort of demonstrate that we can build these complex things and still have clean, understandable HTML. So let's talk about that then. The main question to ask here is that what are the key pieces which are hard to build with a project like this? Validations. How can we apply validations to nested fields on a form? And how do we collect the data in a sound way where when we submit the form, we have this object of data and nothing else? Okay, well, starting off, what we want to ask these questions are like, what are the challenges we come across? How can this be flexible? How can we make it so that all the directives, all the code that we create in this form, we can reuse easily? Finally, what should we avoid? Is using one big controller for the entire form a good idea? Probably not. So these kinds of things we want to avoid. So getting started then, let's first define a form. Well, how do we go about doing this? Well, we would create a form that looks like this. We have the controller, we have the name of the form, and the no validate flag, and the submit. There's 5 things right here that are all coupled together. We have the fact that it's a form, we have to have a name, and for the submit to work, we have to have a controller. Okay, so the point is that even if it seems like you're doing it like complicated in the very beginning, just do it, and then let's refactor the code. So the controller of the form, that's responsible for handling the data when submitted, and the data comes in as an object. The point here, that the key thing to remember is that your form should not do anything with the data. It should just accept the data as it comes in and send it over. And I'll get to why this is important in a minute. So here, all that we're doing is we're checking if the form was considered to be valid, and then we're going to send the data over. The data is delivered as this form object. Okay, so we have the form in place. What about the repeated regions? What about the questions like that we're asking with the select element in the text area? How could we do those? So what we would do here is we'd have a nested form. And the importance of having a nested form is that you can encapsulate all the repeated fields into one area. And then you can assign a controller to manage all the data there. Once again, we have a huge mix mash of the attributes, the different classes that are associated with it, and we have this fields value, which is taking the fields that are going to be collected. That's the model that everything's going to be stored on. Here's what our controller looks like. It's fairly simple, but what I don't like about this is that we have the data that we're collecting, and then we have the code that's doing the transformations in the data. So we have a mix between controller as, and we're still using scope. We want to avoid stuff like this. Okay, so we have the dynamic fields, so the ng-repeat and the class and stuff like that. This is what the actual questions are. So So coming back to this example, these things are the fields that are repeated. Okay, so what about the error messages? Now, this is a very complicated part to do with Angular. And the reason being is because you'd have an ng repeat, and you somehow have to associate the model with the error messages. The trick to doing this is that we use the nested form for each repeated field. So we call the nested form ng-form survey field form, and that way we can just set ng-model to be equal to that. And since we have that in place, we can just use this ng-messages directive, which is new in 1.3, to assign the error messages that are associated with each ng-model instance. And the way that this works is that you can define all the messages in here, and you can have a remote template to associate all the error messages with. Okay, so that was the editor page. There's the preview page, which collects the user data and then previews it to the user. Here we have another complicated mess of ng-controller and a nested form and a repeater form. This is way too much text to read. And then we have the more complicated part, which is displaying the different types of input fields. So we're going to have a text area and a select element and all the variations of an input element. And if you imagine you end up having 20, 30 items, you have this massive HTML file that has all of these different properties. So we've built the form. The form is there. The form works. But now it gets to the part where we actually really improve it using directives. So we have these form features that we've been using. Let's improve it with directives. So what is the goal with doing this? The idea here is that we express everything that the form is going to do as a directive. And that means all the data it's going to be taking in, and then the functions that it's going to be running when the data is valid. Like when you submit the form, it's going to run a function. So in effect, directives are just more like reusable functions in JavaScript. So if anyone here is big on functional programming, you would know that with functional programming, you end up having lots of functions that do very simple things, but when you compose them together, they're very powerful. All right, so the first step is we want to refactor the data and remove that from the logic. So that controller code, which is managing the state of the controller and how that works, we want to actually take the data out of there. Now this is easier said than done, but if you notice code in your directive that has, assigning the initializing data and then downloading from HTTP, putting it on the scope, and then you have the controller code to actually manipulate the code, this isn't necessarily wrong, but if we refactor it, we can develop both sides and not have them interfere with each other as much. And the reason why I'm stressing not to have big controllers is because if you have big controllers, your tests are going to be big, and there's going to be a very special casing, like a lot of special casing, and the tests are going to be very coupled with the HTML code. Okay, so if we can get that to work, which we can't just do on its own, we need to refactor the controllers out of the directives, or controllers to be directives instead. So imagine if we had HTML code like this, where what we did is we have a tag called survey editor form, and then we assign the data, all the data that the form is going to be collecting, and then we have these a method for when it's submitted, and then we have the fields, and we repeat on the fields. This is easy HTML code to read. This is the goal of how you want to do this. So for the preview page then, we would do the same thing, where what we would have is a form, and then for each field, we would have a preview. But if we noticed on the preview fields, we had that complicated ng-switch method, ng-switch mess. So what you want to do is you want to package up all of the dynamic portions of your HTML code and put them into directives as well. So here's what we would end up having for the ng-switch. Here it's switching on the field type, and if it's an input field, we're going to load the controller for the input field, or load the directive for the input field, and input URL is going to load its own directive as well. Here we're defining what properties go into the directive, we're collecting the data on the model, and the field information, if it's required, what the label is, stuff like that goes into there. Then we can make a directive that takes in that data. So right here it's taking in the model, it's setting that as a two-way data binding. It's loading the controller, and it's downloading the template and putting it into the page. Finally, the template is very easy to understand here because it's central to the way that the directive performs. Here, for example, the controller that we defined called component controller is exposing itself on the scope. And then we have the model. And here we have the ng-options code that's loading the data out the model. Now, ng-options is a complicated, like it's great and it works, but the expression code is a little bit complicated. Option. All right. So we have option as option for option and component controller.options. But the point is that the component itself is in its own template and it's loaded in by another directive. So let's take a look at that code. So if I go back here and I click on this code, and you get to the GitHub URL, let's quickly take a look at one of those directives in general. So if we go to the survey preview, here we have the different types of directives. So the text one, the URL one, the email one, they're all loading. They're a directive here, which is assigning the template URL to download. And we saw this code in the slides, but let's take a look at something a little bit more complicated. Let's take a look at the editor page. So I mentioned in the beginning that we wanted to separate the logic from the actual data of the survey. So for example, to make this work, I made a survey editor controller, and that does all the hard lifting to load the data from the storage or download it from HTTP, and then we're going to put it on its own scope, and then we have a function to export the data once it's saved. It doesn't do anything with a form. It just has the controller code to save and load the data. Then for the actual editor form, we have a simple controller that's, once it's valid and submitted, so you see here how we have surveyForm.valid, we're just going to call the onValid submit. And then we're wrapping all of the form code that goes inside of a form. So we've eliminated that whole mess of 5 different attributes communicating with each other, and we expose it as its own directive. And I can go on and explain all the other ones, but I'm sure you guys get the idea. The point with all of this is that there's not a mix and mash of data and logic in your controllers, and that way it makes it easier to test, and the tests will be smaller. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so we've packaged it up. Now for the testing. We have more directives, then we'll have smaller tests. That sounds kind of weird, but the whole point is that just like functional programming, you have small blocks of code, and you use that code with other pieces of code, and then you can do more with your code. And the idea here is that we have small tests for each block of code. So for each directive, we have tests for that. And finally, when the less complex the directives are, the less we need to prepare. What I mean by prepare is you don't need to build this object out in your controller that gets put into the page. So here's an example of how you go test this. Right here, we would just load in a survey editor form. We'd compile that. The compile code's not in here. It's sort of abbreviated. We load that survey form, and then we're checking to see if data exists on there. If you didn't have any directives at all, you can't do this. You would have to have some protractor test or an end-to-end test in some form that would test the entire page out. And what happens if you change one value on there? You have to double check to see if that test is actually working. So if you have directives, you'll have more to show for your JavaScript code, which means that you can test each individual directive as it is. Okay, so I talked about directives mostly. I talked about the complexity of how HTML code can get to. I talked about controllers, but some of the features in 1.3 that are not here, that I didn't cover, or covered a little bit, ng-messages, which is that message control system in Angular 1.3, asynchronous and synchronous validations, and ng-model options. So I'll leave the slide link up here so you can click on this link to get to the web page. So any questions at all about this stuff? Like, I know it's kind of abstract, and I know I kind of... Sorry? Well, it's pretty much the end right now. So, oh, okay, sure. So we'll leave the questions after my talk. Here is my contact details, and my website's herofmoo.com. Here is the link to the slides and the code and the demo. Please copy that or take a picture. Sorry I didn't have that in the beginning. If you get lost in forms, take a look at the demo or the GitHub code repo, because there's a lot of work put into the forms to make them reusable. And I'm sure that your applications could benefit with some of the ideas that are in here. Okay, but that's it for my presentation. Thank you, everybody.
You want to talk
Did everybody get that link? Anybody need another few minutes? Or?
We're going to post it also on the meetup page. So.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Through the mic? Okay. Hello. As Igor said, I'm Jurka Krij. Krij, did I say that right? I also go by Jeff Cross, my given name, American name. I'm going to talk about a tool called bench press. This is going to be a quick talk, just to give you a little bit of a preview of something we've been working on. So the obligatory definition of what bench press is, it's a tool we built to run macro JavaScript benchmarks of apps to measure performance characteristics in real-world conditions. Here's a little bit of a screenshot of the tool. It's something we built for AngularJS, Angular Dart, and Angular 2, so that we could write benchmarks against our own components to see some of the performance characteristics, like how much garbage they're generating during operations, how much memory is retained from operations, and how much time different operations take. So all three projects have their own benchmarks that we run, and we use to measure performance between different SHAs. But it's not just for Angular apps. It's actually a general purpose tool, no dependencies on Angular. And you can use it today, but it's changing pretty quickly. So I just want to show you its current state and tell you a little bit about what we're doing to make it more useful. And we hope that folks will use this regularly in their projects going forward. So why did we build it? A lot of times performance is overlooked. During a project, sometimes you'll only think about performance after you've shipped something and a user starts screaming that a page takes 5 seconds to load, or a certain component is taking a long time, and you focused on features and didn't really think about making it fast. And there were already great tools for micro benchmarks like JSPerf and benchmark.js that will show you how many times something can be done in a second. But that doesn't give you the kind of insight you need. It'll show you what kind of loop you should use maybe for a certain VM at a certain time, but it won't show you other characteristics like in real world conditions when you're sharing memory with other components, how much memory an entire higher level thing is generating that has more complexity to it. So we wanted to make measuring real world scenarios a little bit easier. So I have an example. We have a large table benchmark in the bench press project. It measures how long it takes a table to render with 1,000 rows, I think, and about 10 or 100 columns. And we want to see how much memory is generated when we create and destroy the table. So we create a standalone app to be measured that includes a bench press config. Let me size it down a little bit here. There we go. So we have a little app here that just has an HTML file, a table render file that does the logic of rendering the table, and a config file. So inside the app, we'll add steps to bench press so that those can be run and measured. So we have this global object called benchmark steps that we just push a name and a function to, and bench press will then execute these steps in order when we run a benchmark, and we'll time how long it takes to run this function. But I want to see the performance penalty of adding random background colors to each table cell. So this test up here will be the baseline, and I'll add a variable so I can see how steps perform under different conditions. So I call BP variables add many, and I just add these objects that have a value of baseline and a value of colorful. And inside my benchmark, I say if this variable is selected, then let's add a background color to each cell with a random color. And then I compile the benchmark with bench press, start the bench press server, I launched Chrome Canary from BenchPress, and this is important because you can't get the high precision memory info we want to get without launching Chrome Canary with flags that say we want the precise memory. And then we'll run the test with both variables and see what we get. So this is the compiled benchmark. And you see down here, it tells me the selected variable is baseline. So I'll just run it once and see what we get. And it says that we got 0.12 milliseconds time it took. This is actually the cleanup test. So this is the table renderer where it actually drew the table down here that we see. And that took 53 milliseconds. Didn't generate much garbage. Actually, let me look at it in Chrome Canary here. So the variable is baseline. We run it once. We'll see that it took 45 milliseconds and it generated 1.5 kilobytes of garbage. Actually, megabytes. And when I run the colorful variable and run it one time again, I see that it took longer. It took 138 milliseconds, generated a lot more garbage, and retained a lot more memory because we're adding properties to each of these DOM nodes. So the runner is actually configured where I can run it once, or I can run it on a continuous loop, or run it 25 times and select only 20 samples to take, so it'll ignore the first 5 samples. And it tells you the standard deviation from the set of samples, the mean, and the min and max. So some tips on making these kinds of benchmarks. You want to focus on relieving memory pressure and reducing DOM manipulation. These are the 2 biggest wins. The less memory you have, the better of a citizen your component will be with other components on a page. Usually the things you're testing aren't things that live in a vacuum. And so you want to focus on these things so that the operations that run again and again aren't generating a lot of memory and causing garbage collection to take a long time between operations. You want to use the provided launcher with BenchPress to launch Chrome Canary with the right flags. And it's a good idea to run each test run in a fresh incognito window so that you don't give the VM any chance to optimize before you run another test. And then you want to back away from the keyboard and mouse while it's running, because any scroll event or mouse event could cause something to skew the results. And actually backgrounding your tab will cause the browser to slow down as well. So some things we're working on next. Right now we're working on auto run mode where benchmarks can be run automatically from just opening a page with different configurations and variables. And this is enabling us to build a Karma plugin and also CI process integration so that tests can run for each SHA and you can compare results over time for your different components. And we're working on better tooling for reporting on the results captured from BenchPress and a better tooling for comparing different CLs. And also we're starting to toy around with the idea of a declarative library, sort of like Jasmine, where you can define different benchmarks you want to run based on the same application but in different ways and report on that. And then also just improving the manual run app that I just showed you. So that's it, thank you. And the markdown for this is here. And that also has a link to the BenchPress repository on GitHub, which is at Angular/BenchPress. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So we're going to do Q&A now. Matias, can you come over here? Feel free to ask any questions for the first presentation. Keep in mind that this is being recorded and we need a release form. So if you ask questions, I would like you to go over to Mishko. In that box, we have t-shirts. If you ask questions and sign a release form, you get a t-shirt. So I think it's a pretty good deal. Any questions? Let's start with that.
What caught my ear is a comment you made, Matias, about testing with the directives. So one thing I've noticed from my experience, at least, is that there is a lot of overhead for a lot of developers to even write a unit test with directives, and a lot of developers end up not actually doing it at all, unfortunately. So is there any recommendations if one was to follow a pattern like this to help get developers adjusted to it?
So everybody heard the question, right? I need to repeat that. Okay, great. I guess that's why I have a microphone. So let's think about it. If you don't write any directives at all, and you just sort of leave the unit test until the end, that's problematic, right? However, a lot of developers struggle with getting the code to work at all, and then they think that writing unit tests is just too much work on top of it. And I guess it falls back down to a discipline thing. It's like if you have a lot of experience with testing, then you'll be more prone to writing tests. And it's difficult as a developer to get there. I'm not saying that it's wrong not to write tests, but at least when you do have some tests, you have a little more proof that your code works. Because there's only so much you can contain in your head, and then if who are you going to prove it to if it's not working? And then at least with tests, you'll be able to find what's broken quicker. And with directives in general, it's a part of the template, and you would assume that to test the template, you have to do an integration test. So the whole approach with everything I was trying to do was just trying to make directives closer to unit tests. And this approach with making them smaller and more reusable is kind of heading in that direction. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks.
My question is regarding forms. So a couple months ago, I had a problem with a login form where the user saved his credentials on the form, and when he come back, the form was populated with data, but the model wasn't in the controller. So I want to know if Angular is addressing this issue. Or sure. So in a login form, the user log in and then use the autofill of the browser to complete the information. And after that, when the user come back, the model wasn't with this information.
So I can take this one. I actually have update on this particular issue. The issue I'm mentioning is because of Chrome autofill and autofill feature in other browsers, where the browser doesn't fire the expected events at the right time, and then we don't detect that, hey, the autofill actually injected the value, and we just don't know about it. I just talked to engineer from the Chrome team who said that it should be fixed. We think it's not fixed yet, so we're gonna work with him and show him the use cases where we still this to be where we see that this is still a problem, and we'll try to get it fixed. There is a polyfill that Tobias on our team created. I hear that it works really well for some cases, but it's not 100%. It doesn't have 100% coverage. So there are still corner cases when it doesn't work that well. But I think the better way is to just get it fixed in all browsers, because this is an important feature, and the autofill should just behave as if the user type. Like there should be no difference between autofill and the user filling the form. Other questions?
How are you looking into making forms out of JSON schema? Because that's
Okay, so what we want is we want to have a form that we just pass a JSON object to and it creates it. Kind of like that? Is that what you have in mind? Or? So that's kind of similar to what I did with the survey preview. Think about it. The user is determining the shape of a form, and then the other page is reading that data, right? I don't have a trivial answer. It's not like you do this and it always works. It really depends on the complexity of the form. However, each part that the form gets more and more complex, if you wrap it in a directive and then you control that as its own form within, is probably the way I'd do it. And that's what I did in my preview. So if you can avoid having a huge blob of HTML code, and scoping it into smaller parts of HTML and then going along that route, I would say that that's the way to go.
I'll take one from that end.
Hi, thanks for writing bench press. Question about how you keep the environment consistent over time. As Chrome updates, OS updates, run at different times. Maybe the sun is on the left today, on the right the other day. How do you keep it consistent over time?
So ideally, it should be run on a single calibrated machine. We'll just use this. So ideally, you'll just run it on a single calibrated machine. Otherwise, you just have to compare runs at different CLs against other CLs on the same environment as close as possible, on the same machine at the same time, with as many processes closed as you can have. I think as we build out our tooling that allows you to see time series of data, we'll probably have something that will take deltas from different machines and stitch those together to say, okay, like here's the relative change over time, and you can see raw data, but it will give you a higher level idea. It's not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, we were thinking about this calibrated machine, but I don't think that's the best way to go, just because even Chrome improves over time. So if we get a number like 57 for this version of Chrome, in the next version it can be 37, and then like, you know, we are screwed. So I think the best approach there is just do comparison. So every time you run and bench press test, you run it and compare like the old version of Angular and the new one that you are trying to test, and see what is the difference. And that will tell you on the current version of the browser, are we making Angular better? Like if browser improves, awesome. But we have no influence on that. We care only about not causing regressions in Angular, and this is the way to do that.
I have a question for the bandpass also. When do you release the bandpass? And also, in the Chrome dev, also have the timeline and profile. Are you going to integrate with the dev tool in the future?
Integrate with which tool?
Dev tool in
the DevTool timeline?
Yeah.
We integrate with the profile tool right now. Igor added where you, from within a benchmark, you can click profile. What timeline integration did you have in mind? I have a hard time thinking how it would fit.
So I don't think this is a good candidate for integration with DevTools, just because the DevTools, they're just not going to show you anything more than what show you today. Like you can definitely just run the benchmark once and then look at the timeline and see what happens. You can look at the JavaScript profile or the memory allocation profile and just see like what happens there. But there isn't really much we can do to like better integrate. One thing, however, that we are thinking about is instrumenting the framework and providing additional information, not to DevTools, because DevTools don't accept any information from the application itself, but to tracing frameworks like Web Tracing Framework. If you're not familiar, just Google Web Tracing Framework, WTF. And one thing that we can do, and I showed this off at NG Europe, we can instrument the framework, and instead of you looking at a stack trace and trying to decipher what a flame chart usually looks like in Chrome, it's hard to tell like which frames belong to the framework, which belongs to the application, and like, you know, what is the percentage wise. So by instrumenting the framework, we can actually give you more information about, you know, we are now digesting, and the digest took this long, it had this many iterations, there were this many promises that need to be resolved, and that took this long. So by providing contextual information to the tracing framework, we can actually tell you things like, how long did it take to compile a template or instantiate particular view? And we can show you that, oh, it was this view that we were instantiating. So this is something that DevTools currently don't allow us to provide to them, but there are the solutions that we're looking at in the meantime. But this doesn't have anything to do with BenchPress. BenchPress is just a runner.
Regarding releasing, it's already been released on some minor versions. It's on NPM, and no roadmap to 1.0. We'll probably push another minor release later this week.
We're primarily building this for us, but we're happy to share with anybody who has similar needs, so feel free to use it. We'll see where this will lead us. Other questions?
What role does the compilation step in BenchPress play?
So right now it puts together the HTML file that has the reporting and the HTML file that's part of the benchmark, and puts them into one view, puts the library into the view. It's actually in the context of the auto running mode, it's probably not necessary. It was originally built as a really simple tool where you just manually measure things in a browser, and we're changing it to be a little bit smarter. So I can't think of anything else that it does other than compile scripts and HTML together. So yeah, so he's asking the random colors that got generated in one of my steps. So that gets, so it's like the opposite of micro benchmarks where you see how many you can squeeze in at a time. It will actually just run one step each time. So that step, so each time that step runs, it's creating thousands of these cells that have the random colors in them and measuring aggregate how long that whole thing took. And then you optimize that over time.
Yeah, I have a question about the the form. So I think currently you are using directive. So the problem for me is when in our project we'll have to create a different kind of form. So it will have a lot of different validation. So how can you try to reuse or try to extend a new form based on your directive? How can I try to reuse code?
So how can we extend a form with an existing directive, or?
Yeah, so I think you just create a form and it will have the validation and have some HTML. So the problem is that maybe I want to create another directive. So most of it is very similar to the form directive you create. So how can I try to reuse your code and just add more feature? So
It's a tricky thing to say because there's so many things that could go in there. So I would say that if you treat each directive as its own subform, that's the first step I would do. But is there something I'm missing from your question?
So
I'll help you clarify. We work on similar project. So I think what he's asking is, if you want a extensible system in your form and your directives, right? Like for example, you have an email field, but I want an email field that only accept Google email, Gmail only. And well, validation-wise, that's just be a different validation expression. But there's some other type of control, like slider with 2 handlebar instead of 1, right? Like if you don't have a 2 handlebar, I want to add another one. So how do you extend existing field type?
Okay, so one method is to have a sort of parent controller, and that has like some sort of complicated switch method, like if it's this one, if it's this one, if it's this one. That's what I did. Another option is if you hop into the compile method of the directive, you can sort of change around the HTML code or add or remove bits and pieces before it gets linked. That's another option I'd say. So if you have another directive that sits on top of the input element, then you can add more features to that directive. You're going to do it in a directive one way or another. It just depends at what angle you go into it. Does that answer it? Or? We'll talk after.
Hi, thanks for presenting. And so I want to ask you if you have an experience, or maybe you can share this. So let's say we have a complex form where we separate everything by directives, and they have logic which you separate, and you have all those directives. They have to talk to each other through some logic. So how did you do this? Which pattern did you see, and what was the best?
So the first thing is, since we're using directives, we can make a controller on the directive, and we can have a child directive include that controller. That's one of the benefits of using directives as opposed to using controllers. That's one mechanism. So you expose some method on the parent controller, you load it in to the child directive, and then you can run a piece of code on there. That's one option. Typically with forms, you would do some form of validation mostly in that context. So take a look at the validation API of 1.3, and if you can get away with using that, use that. In your situation, do you have a use case, for example, or something that's... Okay, well, we'll take a look at it after.
And the companies, they have to talk. The companies have to talk to each other. It's like you change some field in one component, and the other component has to reflect the change.
Yeah. So in that regard, you would just add or remove components to the form. That's ngIf would do. However, if it's like a component that you would see that can function as its own component, like think about if you had like 4 input fields and they're all getting collected and those four input fields are always together, you would wrap that whole thing in its own directive, and then you would have a controller on that directive, and each input field would talk with that controller. You might have to do a little bit of work setting up the directive controller and having the methods, but at the end of the day, it's very clear what's going on. You could also use events, scope events, but I personally prefer the directive approach better.
I think that my question is regarding testing. When you say that necessarily, probably you're gonna have less tests when you have a directive approach. Do you think that it's always the case, or when you start reusing the same form that you created as a directive, then you start saving tests? Because I think you have to test the directive anyways, right? And not if you have just one form that's gonna be used only in one place, I, I tend to believe that I would have the same number of tests. And but I see a lot of value on this for uh, being declarative. So as soon as I look to your form, I know what is that about, and I just need to provide you the data. Like I see a lot of value, but I'm not sure about the testing number of tests.
Okay. So for my experience with testing, it's not like, everything can be tested and like will be 100% perfect. But the smaller the code, the easier it is to test. Or like the less that's going on in the code, the easier it is to test. And in my presentation, I said that directives are kind of like functions, right? When you treat them this way. And think about the function, add x plus y. It adds x plus y. You can think of the test, it's going to be very few tests to do that, right? But you're very clear on what data is going into the directive. So what I meant to say with less tests is that if you have smaller directives that do less things, you'll have a higher percent of confidence that you'll know that it works as it is. If you have a directive or a controller that has 50 fields, it'll take you a long time to write tests for each field and then the combination of the fields talking with each other. So it's more of a best practice than a sort of definite solution. And you get into the discipline of making more directives, you'll have easier tests. And then for anything complicated, that's when you can look at writing bigger unit tests or writing an integration test.
And my question is how to control the number of directives when using the form, because for example, for some particular case, we got a lot of fields, and for each of them, we got several cases for validation. So in each of field, we need maybe plenty of validation directives. In that case, the more of the directives, maybe the like the slower the page will be. So how to control the number of directives, and also is there any best practice for that kind of situation?
So Igor, do you want to answer this question about performance, or you want to take a try at it? Okay, so part of the question was about performance with a ton of directives in a form. So let's answer that one first.
Yeah, in that case, there will be plenty of directives for validate. So in that case, that will cause some performance issue.
So there are many aspects to performance, but in terms of just having more directives, there is some cost in setting up the view, but there is no cost in runtime. At runtime, you are only paying the cost of watches, and with 1.3, the dirt shaking mechanism is pretty darn fast. Like many people say, 4,000 watches is the limit. I would like to see an application where 4,001 would be a problem. Like I think we can go way beyond like a couple thousand watches. So is it possible to like dynamically just disable portion of the application? So ngIf does this, but ngIf is pretty destructive. Like it will destroy the DOM. It will also destroy all the watches that are set up. And it can be recreated, but like then you have to make a trade-off whether is it really worth it destroying all this stuff. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. One thing we are thinking of for Angular 2, and there are some ways to do it even for Angular 1x, where you can disable part of the application, like still keep the DOM around, just make it inactive. You can look in the Angular material source code. There are some ways where they like disable scopes and make parts of the view inactive. So there are ways to do it. We are thinking about how to make this a core thing in Angular 2, and then maybe ngIf could just use it by default and not be as destructive as it is today, and be able to reuse DOM and stuff like that.
So to add on to that, let's say that your input field has 10 validators, right? For some reason, the input field's that complicated, and you have to do all these validations to see if it's okay. Maybe it's like a Windows type password, where it has to have numbers and special characters and all that stuff, and each one of those is a separate validator. The way that ngModel works is that whatever value you type in, the validations kick off as soon as that value changes. And that's where you might see a performance impact. So that's what the synchronous validators do. Asynchronous validation, which is new in 1.3, if you return a promise there, it's going to run an HX request or some sort of timeout. And that's great. That's only going to happen once all the other validators, the synchronous validators, pass. So you won't have tons of HTTP requests. However, if that does happen, where if you're checking to see if the username is available and all the other validators pass, and you type in the username, like my name, Matias, and then you keep typing in characters, and it's like HTTP request, HTTP request. The way that you can control that is with this feature in 1.3 called ngModel options, with a debouncer, and you can give it a timeout like 400 milliseconds. If they haven't typed anything for 400 milliseconds, then it's going, after that timeout has passed, then it's going to run the validation.
Yeah, I had a question about the custom validators. So I know you didn't talk much about ng messages, but how do you hook a custom validator into ng messages? Is there like a best practice around that, or?
So it might seem like ng messages is sort of tied into the validator system, but it's not. The way that ng messages works is it just listens on the error object. So there's, from ngModel, there's ngModel.$error, and the error is going to show all the validators that failed. So the first thing you do is you write the validators for the ngModel, like stuff I was talking about with username validation, password validation, and then ng messages will determine which error messages show up at what time. Obviously, if I'm entering an email field, I want to know if the email value is too short before the email is invalid. Stuff like that. So I have a blog article on that on my blog that talks about ng messages. If you take a look at that, you'll see how it fits together.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll just have one-on-one questions and some offline time.
How do you typically handle optional fields? So they leave it blank, that's fine, but if they don't, they type something and then you start the validation.
So ng-required does that by default. So if you set required on an input field, you have to enter it.
Right, but let's say it's you want to validate if they type something, but if they don't type anything, you just want to omit it.
Well, in the validator that you have, like if you make a custom validator, then you have to check, if input field
Is there an easy way to do it without custom validators?
Without custom validators. So like an example of, you have to enter, if you enter a value, it has to be 10 characters or higher, right? Something like that, right?
Like you type in a password, then it will, you change the password for a user, but if you leave it blank, it doesn't change the password, that type of thing.
So required by default will allow it if it's empty. I mean, if you don't have required, it's going to allow it if it's empty. However, if it is there, that's a good question. Like, I would say that you would allow it, and then in your controller, you would determine if it's allowed. Or Igor, do you have a good way of doing this?
We can hack something.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. There might be something. It's such a simple question, but there might be something I'm missing. So we'll take a look at that right now. pattern. Yep, that's a good example as well. That's why I kind of mentioned the custom validator, because if you have empty or some value validator in the HTML, it'll be kind of easy to understand.
Can you repeat the solution?
So question from the audience. The answer from the audience was to use the pattern validator, ng pattern, or the pattern attribute. That's one option. The regex might be a little bit complicated because it's hard to have or this and that and check that. Or I would say once it gets complicated, just make a directive.
Awesome. Thank you, Matias. Thanks, Jeff.